We're still the only parking reform organization that has a mission focused entirely on this topic.
Anyone who wants to be some kind of parking reform ambassador or contact point or correspondent, wherever you are in the world, we'd love to hear from you.
There's a famous scientist, Buckminster Fuller, and on his tombstone it says, "Call me Trim Tab." And there's a story behind that, which is in a very large boat, it's very hard to mechanically turn a rudder because of the forces of the water and the inertia. So when the captain is turning the boat, they don't actually turn the rudder. There's a rudder on the rudder called a trim tab, and they turn that. And that's part of my theory of change here is, we're trim tabs out here, exerting that small influence.
Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome again to the Reinventing Parking podcast. I'm your host, Paul Barter, and today I'm having a chat with the Parking Reform Network President, Tony Jordan, who will be familiar to long-time listeners of the podcast. But for those of you who don't know, he's from Portland, Oregon, and has been working on parking reform for quite a few years now. But the purpose of today's episode is to check in on the Parking Reform Network, because since we last talked, there's just been so much momentum and good news, and we wanted to share that and give people a sense of how they can be involved and just to give everyone a sense of encouragement that things are happening and there's a lot more to do, but we can make this happen. What is the Parking Reform Network and why does it exist and why does it do what it does?
As you mentioned, I got into this issue a while back. I read Donald Shoup's book in 2010 and ran into some local parking reform opportunities here in Portland. And what I realized early on was that the issue was so logical. It made so much sense. There were so many good reasons to do parking reforms. The city staff and even elected officials understood the importance and value of these reforms. But there was a piece missing, which was activism and concerted organizing around the topic, messaging, just keeping the energy up and thinking about how we can push this forward, building coalitions around it. This is almost now 13, 14 years ago, and it was still relatively unknown. And I saw there was a need to reach out to bicycle advocates and transit advocates and housing advocates. And the YIMBY movement was just starting. And to point out and help show that this was really an issue that gets in the way of a lot of progress. It's a stumbling block to a lot of reforms for environmental groups, tenant advocates, people with disabilities. Like almost everything you're trying to do, parking is in the way. And so I formed this organization with some other people in order to provide the support. And basically a network is in the name, a network of people who are working on this issue. And at this point, we've got more than 370 people, mostly in the United States and North America, but around the world, who are journalists and activists and academics and politicians and planners and consultants and just people who find the issue interesting. And we're really starting to see the fruits of this labor pay off in increased activity, better messaging, and more excitement and directed action around this topic.
That's a great introduction. And just, thinking back to that time, say the early 2010s, 2011, 2012, I was aware of a few people around who were talking about parking, but it seemed to me that it was all very scattered and there was quite a lot of confusion, which was part of what motivated me to write about it, because I could see that people were trying, but they were confused about what was really needed. And also I had a sense that people were discouraged. People would often start any article about parking with words to the effect of politicians and local officials hate this issue because it's like some sort of third rail and, they'll never touch it because it's too dangerous to even try to reform it. And so things have really changed in the 12 years or so since then. And the people involved are not feeling so lonely and discouraged, I think. Is that your sense?
Absolutely. I mean, that was something I figured out pretty early on. Was people told me that this was an issue that was difficult and people didn't want to talk about it. And I found people were actually extremely receptive to it. They never thought about it. I never thought about it. Parking is all around us. And the thought about why it's there, how much there is, how much it costs is just, it's completely taken for granted. And I found that people actually, not everybody, but a lot of people were receptive, and some people were very receptive. And actually, sure, there's a lot of the population that doesn't want to talk to you about parking, but there is actually a lot of people who really are passionate about this once they hear about it, want to talk about it. They're usually very interesting people. They're usually very friendly, thoughtful people, working in all sorts of places. And we've had, over the last few years, we've had social events and parties that there's kind of a joke that like these parking reform parties they're really fun. We had 200 people show up to a happy hour in Washington, D.C. for TRB at the Yimby Town in Portland in last April. We had the best social event of the conference. Repeatedly, we've shown that people will come out and talk about parking and commiserate and scheme and just get together. And it's really great for movement building.
And I guess before we go too much further as well, we're kind of assuming we're talking to insiders who know about parking reform, but just in case anyone listening who is coming to this new, what we are talking about in terms of parking reform is the first thing you should do is focus on on-street parking management and stop trying to build so much parking. In most places, we've got way too much parking, not a shortage. But even in places where people think there's a shortage, usually that's not really true. It appears to be a shortage because we're not managing the existing parking efficiently, effectively, wisely. So in short, what we want to do is put more focus on parking management, abolish the parking mandates, and stop, by all means, for goodness sake, stop subsidizing parking.
Right. That decades and decades of mandating the parking has created both a dependency on automobiles and an entitlement from people who drive automobiles that they have a priority and a preference for storing this personal property, which takes up a lot of space and a lot of cost. And I think, the reason this issue is so important, the reason I got into this issue is that if we do want a future where we have the ability to not be car dependent, and so that we have independence for people who can't drive or don't want to drive, and so we have abundant housing in places where it belongs, and so we can make progress on climate change, we have to take this head on. This is one of like the big, highway building, fossil fuels, parking are probably the three core pillars of what props up car dominance, car dependency, and it's a piece that has been underappreciated and not organized around much.
Yeah. And no matter what you think about, say, climate change or public transport, cycling, you can still support parking reform because at its core, the minimalist version is just doing parking better than we were doing. The old way is just idiotic, even on its own terms. It's not succeeding even on its own terms to get parking more efficiently and effective to motorists that need it. So even on those terms, you want reform. But of course, that stupid approach to parking has all these side effects of shortages of housing, unwalkable, unbikeable, terrible transit, etc., etc. So car dependence. So many of us go a little further and we want parking reforms that will expand the other options and somewhat restrain traffic and car ownership, car use. But those are the optional extras. The core of it is just a sensible approach to parking that is not artificially subsidizing parking and driving and cars. End of rant.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. So having sort of spelled out where we're at and why we're at it, let's talk about that momentum. Like there's been quite a few things happening in the news and events. For example, you were mentioned in the New York Times, Tony. Wow.
Yeah. Well, the Parking Reform Network was mentioned in the New York Times last month. when you read a mass media article, you might always be like, man, they could have mentioned this more or that more. But I think when you look at the fact that it's not a Sunday New York Times article, but a New York Times feature article about parking reform that really kind of lays out the reasons for it and a bit of what's going on, mentions the Parking Reform Network, talks about, just activism in general, is really helpful to when you think about how many people read the New York Times. It's quite an audience. That was probably the first that I've seen in-depth parking reform focused article in there. And the War on Cars is a bit of a niche podcast as well, but it was, featured several times on that recently. They did a whole episode with Donald Shoup. One of our members and donors was mentioned on another episode, their 100th episode. They regularly mention it. We had a great shout out and feature in a popular YouTube channel called City Nerd at the end of last year. Katie Gould and the Sightline crew continue to crank out great journalism on parking reform. There was a very long article in the Lincoln Institute's magazine that's been syndicated and broken up and reprinted all over the place. Strong Towns, Streets Blogs, CNU. There was a great feature by author and journalist who's also a member of PRN, Anna Fitzpatrick, in a magazine called Scope of Work that was actually a lot about Parking Reform Network itself. There's a book coming out, Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar, which is about parking reform and parking policy. And then Professor Shoup continues to rack up accolades. I don't know if he's got a trophy shelf or what, but I was just in Florida a couple weeks ago at a ceremony where he received a prize from the Seaside Institute, which is a prestigious New Urbanism Award or New Urbanism and Planning Award, which was really fantastic. So I think that this is definitely coming around. People are seeing that this was something that is important, and that's getting, just the drumbeat of coverage and awareness is definitely getting out there.
Yes, yeah, that's fantastic. There was one thing you mentioned by the by there is that the War on Cars mentioned us, and I think one of the things they mentioned was one of our members decided to donate their insurance payout, and it's quite an inspiring story. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, this is a member named Eric Ariano who lived in Phoenix and was riding their bike to breakfast and was hit by someone driving a truck and broke their collarbone, and the person drove away. Fortunately, Eric had uninsured motorist coverage, I believe, which is kind of one of those things where even if you aren't driving or own a car, you need to think about whether you protect yourself from people who are driving cars. In between that time when they were hit and now, they found out about the Parking Reform Network. And because we are an issue that hasn't had a lot of attention, Eric felt that this was an organization and a policy area and an issue that a little bit can really go a long way. Where the Parking Reform Network is a lot like a startup business or something, where our product is social change or policy change, but where we are at doing so much with so little as far as being unstaffed and our funding is growing, but it's still pretty small, that donating their insurance settlement to the Parking Reform Network was, equivalent to about what we had received last year entirely in contributions. So this was a really inspiring story. Eric is not only a tremendous supporter of the organization, but it provides great advice and has been involved with the organization. And I think that's allowed us to really think a lot bigger this year.
Yes, yeah, no, thank you, Eric. Really, for someone like me who's been working on this mostly in a voluntary capacity for so many years and cross-subsidizing my efforts on this from other sources of income, and you as well in a similar position, and so many of our active people just donating their time. It's just such a encouraging thing to hear that someone was inspired by what we're doing, and so thank you for that, Eric. Really, I was speechless for a while after reading about that. Yeah, and on that topic of Parking Reform Network people getting out and about and doing stuff, there were a whole series of events where Parking Reform Network has had a presence, whether it's been you or another member.
I did a little bit of traveling at the middle of last year in October, and we threw a great party celebrating California's AB 2097 statewide bill in Los Angeles. I went to Dallas and met with planning staff and people in the region there, and we had a party. But then really this year we've kicked it off. I went to Washington, D.C. for the Transportation Research Board annual meeting. That was a great opportunity not only to attend their subcommittees on parking and the ITE subcommittee on parking, but also connect with other organizations in the DC area and politicians around parking. And then we threw, as I mentioned, a pretty great social event with some local partners. I then was in Florida for the Seaside Prize, but then went to Los Angeles for this one-day conference called Curbivore that was about street commerce and some curb management, and we co-hosted an event there with the Open Mobility Foundation and the Shared Use Mobility Center. Coming up, I'm going to be speaking with Katie Gould at a small event, a one-day event in Port Townsend. Then in May, I'll be at the Shared Use Mobility Summit. The Parking Reform Network will be there as a co-sponsor. We'll be planning a social event there as well. So if you're going to that conference, let us know. I'll be at the Strong Towns. They're having a national gathering that is the day before the Congress of the New Urbanism meeting. We'll be at both of those events. And we're planning on into the summer, I think, well, there's another event in Portland, Urbanism Next. We'll probably do something around that. There's a one-day curb management convening in New York with Open Plans, who just are having, this podcast will be airing after it, but they're having what I think is the first rally to end parking mandates in New York City tomorrow, which is, we're recording this on March 22nd, so it's the 23rd. And we're planning to, one of our long-term goals at the Parking Reform Network is we want to build what we're calling a speaker bureau to help connect people to help make putting out proposals for panels or group presentations easier and help make sure that people have some kind of base idea and messaging around the Parking Reform Network so that these are not only, we're getting the word out about the movement, but also making sure that people are presenting the most kind of cutting edge ideas and concepts and have the more up-to-date news so that we're constantly moving forward. I think for a long time, and these presentations and accomplishments have been great, but we've heard a lot of the same examples, and I think that making sure we're getting contemporary examples where people are pushing the envelope and trying out new things and seeing how they work is really important to keep momentum going and to get more comprehensive reforms implemented.
Yeah. Yes. So there was a lot there, and I want to pick up on one or two threads that you mentioned. One of them relates to the international scene, right? Because I often mention we're keen to grow and we're keen to expand, but of course at the moment we have limited capacity and we don't have any paid staff just yet. But this idea of a speakers bureau is wonderful in terms of like multiplying the effort. If you are already active on parking, maybe you're already a member and you want to be part of this and be spreading the word, and you feel a little shy or nervous that you don't know what to say, we can help. Anyone who wants to be some kind of parking reform ambassador or contact point or correspondent, wherever you are in the world, we'd love to hear from you, because it's through people on the ground in many places that this movement will spread. It can't be a top-down centralized thing. There's only one Tony, there's only one podcast. We just have limited bandwidth. There's already quite a group of people and it's growing, but we need more. So your participation would be really valuable. Listeners, please.
Yeah, you can go to parkingreform.org/join. We have a pretty liberal contribution and membership policy, and there's also a link on there if you are a student or an activist for whom making a contribution is at all of a problem. If you're interested in moving this forward, we want you in our Slack channels. We want you on our mailing list so that you can be aware of what's going on and connect with people. So it's really a people-based and partner-based movement too. If you're a part of an organization that is a bicycle or a pedestrian or a housing or environmental organization, sustainable development, please get in touch, because we're building out our partnership areas, which is really this coalition building is how it's going to get done on a local and statewide and other levels, regional levels.
I'm glad you mentioned the Slack, because I wanted to mention that the Parking Reform Network Slack is very valuable, and it's becoming increasingly valuable for me. I used to rely quite a lot on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter for getting my parking reform news and contacts and discussion, but I'm not finding them as useful as I used to. But the Slack, the PRN Slack, the quality of the discussion, and if people ask a question, almost invariably they'll get a bunch of really useful responses. So it's a very valuable service that the network has, and becoming a member gives you free access to that.
There's activity going on in our community where people are sharing notes, vetting each other's proposed legislation, and asking for advice on how to improve things at both statewide and local levels. I spend a lot more of my time every week, increasing amounts of time, just on the phone with people on planning commissions or who worked for city commissioners or are activists in other places. So I think that bringing those people together, it emboldens them, right? People feel they've got friends. There's people doing it elsewhere. You could say these people I talk to, these smart folks in other states are thinking about this. And there's almost a feeling of fear of missing out, I think, among some of these places. States don't want to, they're going to hopefully start leapfrogging one another. No one yet has put out the bill that says that there's going to be a, complete parking mandate elimination, but we're close. And I'll point out there was a tweet on March 17th from U.S. Representative Robert Garcia, who's from Long Beach, California. It said, "Forced mandatory parking minimums are contributing to our housing and climate crisis. Outdated parking standards need major reform in downtown cores and along impacted rail and transit lines. We're working on a major federal bill to address that challenge." So it's possible this session we will have a federal legislation. Hopefully it will pass, but even if it doesn't, the conversation that comes around that and the recognition that this is an issue of national federal importance that people should pay attention to is really, really gratifying. It really makes you feel like you're not working on something that's just, in a corner of academia or whatever. It's an important issue, and people are noticing that.
Yeah. And you mentioned ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, I think it is, in the US, which is one of the key institutions that puts out a document, or several documents actually, that reinforce parking mandates. And I think our board member, Jane Wilberding, attended some event there, because organizations like that they've been very slow to change, right? They're paying a little bit of lip service to the need for reform, but then they still put out new editions of these documents that reinforce the status quo.
We know that they recognize that the parking generation manual has been used improperly. I think they have a caveat in there not to use it. I don't know why they want to continue to put it out if they know it's being misused. But there certainly is an awareness in a lot of engineers and planners that these mandates are problematic. So the fact that we're starting to get involved in these organizations that have been a little more academic and maybe harder to shift the conversation. I had a few minutes to speak at the TRB parking subcommittee when I was in Washington, D.C. for that, and that was great. So it's starting to build these relationships and help just, I think, get people involved with a wider variety of viewpoints and to, there's the concept of we're opening the Overton window, right? We're creating space for people to recognize that there is a quite a lot that can be done differently and should be done differently.
Yeah. And these organizations like ITE, the American Planning Association, APA, TRB, they are American organizations, but their membership actually is international, and they have an international influence. If these three organizations, and there's probably others, changed their guidance on parking, that would make a difference internationally, not just in the US. That would be really powerful. And listener, again, there's possibly a role for you. Many of you will be members of one of these organizations, TRB, APA, ITE, or if you're not in the United States, maybe you're a member of a planning association, a transportation engineering association, or a professional association that gives guidance on parking in your country. You could be making a difference within those organizations by writing a letter to the leadership saying, look, parking reform is important, and you can help make it happen. The momentum we're seeing is just a demonstration that ordinary people, ordinary members of associations, ordinary members of professional associations, you write a letter, you might not think it makes a difference, but these things absolutely do make a difference. You may not see it. Things change slowly, and then suddenly they change quickly, and that's what we're seeing in parking reform.
Oh, absolutely. There's an anecdote. There's a famous scientist. Many people probably are aware of this person, Buckminster Fuller. It was popularized geodesic domes and a lot of other interesting things. And on his tombstone, it says, "Call me Trim Tab." And there's a story behind that, which is in a very large boat, it's very hard to mechanically turn a rudder because of the forces of the water and the inertia. So when the captain is turning the boat, they don't actually turn the rudder. There's a rudder on the rudder called a trim tab, and they turn that, and that starts to push the rudder in a different direction. I think that's part of my theory of change here is, we're trim tabs out here, exerting that small influence. I mean, I got into this issue because I read a blog post that someone who is also not a planner put on a blog. Like, they just posted about parking, and I read it. And then I got the book from Professor Shoup, and now I'm doing this. So you never know what your letter is going to do. So it's always worth it to just put a little bit of effort out there, like you said, because you never really know when that's going to come back and really have an impact. Yeah, and I also wanted to mention, when you brought up the people in professional organizations, PRN, it's an interesting hybrid because we certainly have an activist DNA, right? I'm about trying to inform people about and change these policies. But we have professional resources that people use. Our parking mandates map, which contains zoning code examples from cities around the United States mostly, but also around the world, but hundreds of cities that have done some reforms to eliminate parking mandates either in their entire city or in certain parts of their city. This is being used by planners around the country. We put out a guidebook on parking benefit districts. Now we have a new map we just released that shows how much surface parking and to some degree structured parking there are in city centers. It's a place where you can get professional advice, and you can also connect with people who are going to help you think about messaging and the political side. And it's also for whether you're a professional or someone looking to get into these industries. It's great opportunities for access. We had an intern who wrote this report on the parking benefit districts, just got accepted into graduate school based on the strength of this report, which was also printed in the APA State of Transportation Planning by, every 2 years they put out this book, and this manual got in there. I was talking to another member yesterday who got their current job with a large consulting firm, came out of a message that was on the Slack channels. It's a tight-knit community still, I think, parking policy. So you can get access to the people who are really the thought leaders or the industry leaders in this policy.
Yeah, that's right. And we're aware very few people have parking as their main thing, right? It's not what motivates most of us. So most of our members are, they started primarily as, say, bicycle advocates or transit advocates, or quite a few actually come from kind of a business background and it's small scale development background, or downtown business district kind of backgrounds, right? So we've got people of all political viewpoints, and activists, business people, developers, consultants, professionals. It's very diverse, and most are not primarily about parking, but whatever the thing that motivates you, as Tony said earlier, parking gets in the way. And it's hard to grapple with without some support and information and people to ask questions. And that's where we can come in, and this networking on this issue, which kind of falls in the cracks of so many other issues. The value of this network is enormous, because it helps people who, parking is not their number one thing. And when parking comes up, it used to be really hard to find out how should I handle the parking, but now you can turn to something like PRN and get some help. And that's what we're here for.
Absolutely. It doesn't take that many people in any particular city. You need a few people, key members of influential or good organizations to understand this and be tied into PRN. We don't necessarily need every member of a Strong Towns chapter to become members of the Parking Reform Network. We just need one or two people to be tied in so that when they need advice, they can get it and they can bring the messaging back to the organization.
Yeah, that's right. By the way, those of you who are out there who are thinking, again, what can I do? One of the things you can do is let us know what's happening in your organization, in your city, in your town, in your state, in your country. We really need your help to know what's going on, because there's just such a growing list of places where there's a debate happening, where there's maybe a government doing some wrong thing that needs calling out, but also governments that are doing the right thing. Please tell us. Don't assume that we have our tentacles on all of the pulses. Unless you tag us or email us or tell us, we may not hear about these wonderful things that are happening. And so you tag us, we will retweet, we will reshare that news, and we'll try to help you and be encouraged. And
particularly, I will say, because of these statewide prohibitions on parking mandates or statewide reforms, that there's a much greater interest now in, for example, residential parking management. There's plenty of great ideas, but we need examples of that on the ground. So if you're working on something or you've worked on something innovative or you know something, we need those examples. They're in very high demand, and get in touch with us. And then once again, that's where hopefully then we can help to spread your story and you get some credit, and it's professional development for you or personal development for you, or just you get some recognition for what you're doing. We want to share those stories and build each other up.
We've been trying to convey the idea, Tony, that there's a lot happening, there's a lot of good news, but there's a huge long way to go in terms of public understanding of this issue. And most cities around the world still are doing it the old way. So we're turning that rudder, but the ship has a huge amount of momentum in the wrong direction. And although we can see that ship is turning, we have a long way to go. So we really need a lot of help. We need your donations, your membership, your activity, your information, your encouragement. Please get involved. If you've listened to the end of this podcast, you are exactly the kind of person we really want to be actively involved if you've listened this far. So please get involved.
Yeah, of course. If you have access, if you have a foundation, you are a person who can provide a lot of support, be it financial or as a volunteer, that's absolutely necessary. But I will say also, just signing up, making a small contribution, becoming a member really helps us. It validates what we're doing. It shows us that you agree with the mission, that you care, that you want to be involved. And I think it's important. So if you've heard about us and you, for some reason, haven't joined or just even haven't signed up for the mailing list, we're still the only parking reform organization that has a mission focused entirely on this topic. Some people have said, why do we need something like that? And I think that precisely because there are so many facets to this issue. What the Parking Reform Network serves to kind of tie all that together, and this is why we need this organization, is to keep a holistic view and keep the momentum moving and keep the energy up and keep people motivated for the long haul on this.
Thanks, Tony. I think that was really informative and encouraging. I feel encouraged and empowered, and I'm going to go off and do
it's a lot of fun. There's so much work to do, Paul, but it's good. It's so gratifying, and the people the people I've met through this are fantastic. If for nothing else, really, if you want to meet some really friendly and thoughtful people, get involved in parking reform. By the time you're listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast as a subscriber, you've already cleared so many hurdles as a great person, in my opinion. So yes. Once you've come to the conclusion that parking reform is good, you're okay with me.
So thanks, Tony, and thanks, listeners, for listening. In coming months, we have lots of very interesting episodes planned for you from both the United States and from around the world. And I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you'll join the Parking Reform Network, and at the very least sign up for the email newsletter. So thanks for listening, and see you again next time. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.